Hi, this is Richard Lee from the Hall Institute of Public Policy, and welcome to the Hall Institute Public Forum. Our guest today is someone who usually sits in this seat as the host, but Michael Riccards, Executive Director of the Hall Institute. Mike, welcome to the view from the guest seat.
It's good to be on again.
Okay. And before we start our conversation, just wanted to remind everybody that the Hall Institute Public Forum is an interactive program. If you're watching us live and you'd like to take part in the discussion, ask us a question, submit a comment, just look for the chat icon on your screen, click that, and follow the simple instructions. So the reason we're having Mike on as a guest instead of a host is because we're still almost 2 years away from the next presidential election, but campaigns start earlier and earlier. And actually, 4 years ago, it was around this time, the Hall Institute was starting our NJ 2008 project, where we were looking at the presidential race, what issues were important to people in New Jersey. Things are a little different this time around. There doesn't seem to be quite the level of excitement, maybe because we have an incumbent president as opposed to having an open seat. But there has been some interest, particularly here in New Jersey. Our Governor Chris Christie's name, there's a lot of speculation about him as a candidate, even though he continuously, denies it. So I thought it would be good to have Michael on. Michael, in addition to, or before he took over the Hall Institute, had a long, distinguished academic career. His expertise is the presidency. He's written a number of books, including a 2-volume history of the presidency. So I thought it would be good to have Mike on, tap your expertise about what qualities are needed in a good president, and then see, whether or not, how our governor stacks up. So I thought a good way to start is, we were talking recently, I know you've been working on a list of who you think are, the best presidents. And as we talked about it, there's some familiar names, people you would expect, maybe some unexpected ones. So I wonder if you could walk us through who you think some of our better presidents were and why.
Well, I think it's an extraordinary office. And as I've said before, it's an office that probably twice has really saved the nation. Once during the Civil War, of course, and once during World War II. We forget how close the West came in 1941 to losing the war to the Nazis. So I looked at what I thought are the great presidents. And I started off with, of course, the patriarch, George Washington. First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen.
First on your list.
And first on my list. The second that I've looked at is Andrew Jackson, who of course was a kind of irascible war hero who destroyed the banks and was really the first assertive, populist, democratic president. The third was a disciple of his that most people don't know about, James K. Polk. Polk, I think, is a great president, and Harry Truman once mentioned him as a great president. I said kiddingly to somebody, he stole half of Mexico and a good part of Canada, what became Oregon. But he was in many ways a great one-term president. And he was a disciple, as I said, of Andrew Jackson. The greatest president, of course, of the 19th century, and some people believe the greatest president of all time, is Abraham Lincoln, who saved the Union and freed the slaves. Followed by that is a long gap, a long period, and finally we get Teddy Roosevelt, who I think is certainly not as great as Lincoln, but is an awfully exciting guy to write about and read about and everything he did. Sometimes he comes across a little wacky, but I think he's a great president, and his attitude towards the office is very different from his predecessors. He said, "I can do whatever isn't expressly prohibited in the Constitution." Other people said, well, you can only do what is specifically granted to you. But Roosevelt had, of course, a much broader concept. The next is Woodrow Wilson, the president of World War I. And of course, most people remember Wilson just because of the tragedy of the League. They forget his first term. He was an incredible president in terms of domestic reform. And by the way, for 18 months, he was a very good governor. I think he's one of the 2 best governors the state's ever had. He and Richard Hughes, a more modern governor in the 60s. Then after Woodrow Wilson, of course, comes a person who was a protege of Wilson and a cousin of Teddy, and that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the greatest president of the 20th century, and many people believe is really the greatest president of all time. He not only brought us through 2 terrible, difficult periods, the Great Depression, created the New Deal, the origins of the welfare state, and then, of course, was the commander-in-chief during World War II. And he's followed by Harry Truman, who, when he left office, was incredibly unpopular. And then, for a variety of reasons, he became seen in the eyes of historians and the American people as a great president, as really the founder of the imperial presidency, with the creation of the National Security Agency, the CIA, the emphasis that he placed on NATO, North American Treaty Organization, the Marshall Plan, the creation of the Defense Department, which used to be divided into War Department, Navy, and whatever. I think what you have now is the beginnings then of the imperial presidency that you and I know. And the last one that I look at is Ronald Reagan, who's a president, I think, who changed the dialogue and reasserted American conservatism.
Okay, great. Well, I knew that Abraham Lincoln was going to be on your list because you have a special affinity for Lincoln, and you just finished a term as chairman of New Jersey's Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. And before we move on with our discussion, I know you were involved with an event at the State House recently, and I think we have a short clip from it. You just, maybe set up the clip on what was this event all about.
Well, as the Bicentennial Commission, the last major event that it did was to honor Lincoln coming through New Jersey 150 years ago. He went from Springfield, Illinois, and his famous farewell to the people, where he never would see again, down through New Jersey into Washington, D.C. He stopped several places in New Jersey, and one of the places he stopped was here, across the street with the state legislature. And there, to each house individually, he gave an address. And some of what he said later became very famous. He said, he called the Americans the almost chosen people. And he spoke and said of the South and the beginning of secession, "I intend to stamp my foot and place it down hard." And he did, which means I'm not going to tolerate secession. Let there be no doubt about it. And so we had those two events, one in the State House, where the Hall Institute and its founder, George Hall, donated the money to put a plaque up to honor the 200th anniversary of the great emancipator. And there's already one from the 100 years. And for the 300th, I'm not going to worry about that. It's somebody else's problem. And then we went on to the State Museum, where, again, Lincoln gave the two addresses. And we had questions, and then after that, we had a discussion of what the causes were of the Civil War. And finally, one of our members took people to see the flag collection, which we have over next door in the archives.
Yeah, I know, it was quite a day. So I think we have a short clip of someone portraying Lincoln at that event. So if we can just switch to that, and then we'll jump back into our discussion of the presidents.
This is Bob Costello, the reenactor.
I must say that my visit to New Jersey, while it has been a rapid trip through the state, for I do have duties in Washington that I must tend to, principally to take the oath of office, it has been an enjoyable visit.
That was Bob Costello portraying Lincoln at the Lincoln event that Michael just described. And if you're interested in that, we have additional footage of that event that we will be putting on our website. But let's get back into, you went through a list of, presidents and why you thought each one of them, what was something special. Were there qualities that were, that kind of ran through all of them? Like, were there qualities that they all shared that made them good presidents?
Well, I think, first of all, they are generally good presidents, great presidents. Mm-hmm. Well, there are a lot of other good presidents, but great presidents are people who lead us through periods of crisis, because that's where you see their leadership abilities. And so I think that's important. You have the leadership ability to lead a free people, and we're very contentious people. We're very difficult to lead. Even the great presidents had a tough time in the presidency. You can imagine what the mediocre presidents had. And I think that they, first of all, are people that stand for more than just themselves. Every one of those people that I mentioned is linked to a larger ideology or a larger movement. Washington, of course, and the federalism and the Union. Lincoln, saving the Union and emancipation. Franklin Roosevelt and the Four Freedoms. Wilson, to make the world safe for democracy. So I think that they are linked to things that are greater than themselves. A great president also, as Karl Rove has said, lives off the capital of other great presidents before him. A lot of what George W. Bush did, you can go back and cite precedents, some, not all, with Franklin Roosevelt and with Lincoln. So they live off the capital of each other, and someday people will be living off George W. Bush, as controversial as he is. I think the second thing is that they have to be people who are somehow articulate in the media of their time. Roosevelt, of course, with his beautiful use of the radio. Kennedy and later Reagan with the marvelous use of television. Reagan, of course, was so natural because he did that for a living. I remember once seeing him come into an empty room, and he looked at where the lighting was, and he walked over to where the line would have been when you would have taped something. He knew exactly what to do. And I remember one time he came back from the hospital, and he was really very weary, and he was doing a press conference, and as soon as he hit the steps leading up to the podium, he sort of became sort of jaunty and popped up and smiled. So partly is, can you use the media? Lincoln's speeches, of course, very few people ever heard Lincoln speak. He had a high-pitched voice, actually. But his written word, the Gettysburg Address, the two inaugurations, they represent a man with an incredible command of the English language who had only 4 months of education. Can you put a good team together? Even if it's a team that's sometimes difficult. Roosevelt had an incredible team. Wilson had an interesting team nobody ever really looks much at. Lincoln had, to use Doris Kearns Goodwin's great expression, a team of rivals. She saw him as bringing all these rivals in. What she doesn't tell the reader is that most of the original rivals were losers, and he got rid of them after a year or two. So they weren't great choices. One, they almost impeached him. And of course, Washington had an incredible group of young men around him from the Revolution, Jefferson and Hamilton and Knox and those people that had really pretty much been a part of the Revolutionary War generation. Can you build a great team? Okay. I think that's important. And also, do you make the right judgments?
Okay. Have the qualities that make a good president changed over the years, or are there things that are more important today than there were back in the 19th century?
I think the communication skills, you're better at knowing that than I am, but the communication requirements have certainly changed because of the pervasiveness of the media. I think the second thing that probably has changed is it's a very difficult office, and it's getting more difficult because we as Americans don't seem to want to have any consensus on things. It's very hard to govern. Roosevelt once said something. He said it's difficult to govern a free people. You look over your shoulder and find out there's nobody there. And I think that's what it sometimes, and what we ask of these people is kind of nutty. Also, of course, politics is much more personal. We know things about the president's personal lives that up to Kennedy, through Kennedy, we never knew. We never knew the types of escapades they had been involved in. Right. Even in the White House under Harding, That's changed. Everything's fair game. In fact, it's more fun. It's the Washington Post mentality. See it on page 5.
Okay. One of the things that you mentioned was, no matter when it was, the president had to be adept at understanding the media of the day. Whether it be Roosevelt, Kennedy with the press conferences, and as we maybe talk a little bit about Governor Christie, I've always been impressed with the way he understands the internet, the way he uses YouTube and things like that, today's media, very effectively. So I think that certainly would make him a good candidate. And I'm just wondering, are the qualities, do you need different qualities to get elected than you do to actually be a good president?
That's always been one of the problems. To get the nomination, you need different qualities than to run a country. Yeah. So people who are really great candidates become lousy presidents. And people who are mediocre in terms of the media to turn out to be terribly significant presidents. But most of them tend to be good at, most of the the great administrators, tend to really be governors. They're people who've had experience running something. Maybe it's a state like New York. The two Roosevelts were governor. Wilson, I mentioned, was governor of our state. Lincoln was not. Lincoln never had any administrative position. President Washington ran the Army for the longest period of time. He learned an awful lot from running the Army. Running a faculty meeting is not a good primary ground for being president.
Is it not a democratic process?
Yeah, it's not. It's being president of the United States is not a democratic process. There's a difference too. Republicans have a strong chief of staff, and that goes back to Eisenhower. The Democrats have a weak chief of staff and decentralized and want everything to come into them. But you're president, you really just can't be. You'd be overwhelmed. And so going back to Eisenhower and Nixon too, they had very strong chiefs of staff. And I think that was a strong way in which they ran the country.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about Governor Christie, and you've kind of laid out what you think makes a good president. We've seen Chris Christie as governor for a little more than a year now, but he was in the public spotlight for a number of years prior to that as U.S. Attorney, running the U.S. Attorney's office. How does what you've seen of the governor, how does he stack up, in terms of these qualities that you see that make a good president?
Well, I think that the one you've mentioned is a good one, that he has a sense of modern media. Right. He comes across and is totally unintimidated by being on Face the Nation, or Meet the Press, or the 24/7 cycle. Yeah.
If anything, I think he tries to put the reporters
and he's very successful at it, I think. That is important. The second is he has a will to prevail. That is, he's not willing to compromise right off the bat the way Obama. That's one of the problems with the Obama administration. The president does not give a sense of strength. And George W. Bush, whether you liked him or not, did. Christie does. And I think that's important, especially when there are so many barons in the field, You've got to give a sense of really being strong. On the other hand, I don't know if America is ready for a steady dose of the Christie style. You can do that for a while, and you can do it in a state like New Jersey where everybody's always angry about everything. But when you're on the road and you're out there in Iowa, and it's the winter, and it's 6 o'clock at night, and people are coming into the caucuses, I don't know if they want to really have that sort of in your face. I know in New Hampshire, where I used to live in Massachusetts, that really would turn people off. So some styles are successful somewhere, and some styles are not successful elsewhere. I watched Bill Clinton, I was there that night, who was about as far away from New Hampshire as anybody could be, and a woman came up and told everybody about her problems, and people just sort of listening, and he was on a really short DS, and he stepped down, put his arms around her and said, "I feel your pain." It became a keynote of his catchphrases. So I think that with Chris Christie, you don't really think he feels your pain.
We have a comment and a question from the internet.
Okay, what do we have there?
From Freedom NJ via Twitter. Easy question. Governor Christie is too liberal and made no significant budget cuts. What's your response to that?
Okay, you want to take that one?
Well, he's too liberal. I think that, first of all, remember, he's in a very liberal state, and he's probably the most conservative that you could get out of a liberal state. And he has made budget cuts. If he hasn't, why are people complaining? Why are the school districts complaining so much? He hasn't made as much as the Tea Party people have, but if you went the Tea Party route, I don't think New Jersey could really tolerate that just in terms of its body politic. It's just too much.
Yeah, I think he's always going to be too liberal for the far-right part of the party. And, yes, he has made budget cuts, but I'm kind of a believer that, his record isn't quite matched, by his record.
Yeah,
people believe he's done a lot more, and when you actually look at the numbers, they're not as substantial.
I think that's true,
but that's true of a lot of politicians.
That's true. Yeah, and also, as I said, it's a tough. He's changed the rules of engagement. Mm-hmm. He's changed the nature of the Democrats are totally fearful of him in the legislature, and there's some good people in the legislature too. When Corzine was there, and I used to watch them, they thought he was, he was sort of like a ragamuffin. They weren't afraid of him. They crossed him, his own party.
Right.
Christie's party stays with him totally down the line. There just aren't enough of them to win the legislative support.
Yeah, but in addition to being able to manage the media well, he's very good at making alliances when he needs to with certain Democrats to get his agenda through.
And I think he's got in the state Senate a Democrat who understands the problems and trying to come up with solutions as well. Is Steve Sweeney. You had a comment?
Yeah, there's also, what do you make of the recent Gallup poll that ranks JFK as the president with the highest approval rating and Nixon as the lowest? And they have a link. The poll they're citing ranks the 9 most recent presidents in the last 50 years.
Yeah. Well, I think that I don't agree with that. I think that Kennedy was an incredible guy. Many of us were inspired when we were young by him. But he made some major problems, led us into Vietnam, was very slow on civil rights. But he was only president for 1,000 days. I mean, you can't really have much. If he had been president for 2 terms, I think he would be a very significant figure. I think that Richard Nixon was one of the finest presidents we ever had. Now, boy, last time I said that, I got people coming down all over me because of Watergate. Yes, Watergate was bad. He shouldn't have done Watergate. But the things he did do were incredible, not just in foreign policy, which we all know of, but even in domestic policy. His treatment of the Indians was stellar. I once asked John Ehrlichman, his assistant, why was he so pro-Native American? He said, because when his mother was sick, she said to him, Richard, this country has been terrible to the Indians. If you're ever in a position where you can help them. He loved his mother. It was as simple as that. So I think that Nixon's a very good president. I think Lyndon Johnson was a great president in many ways. But I think Kennedy, unfortunately, we really haven't had a chance to experience what he could have given us.
What are your thoughts?
There are other people I should mention. You mentioned about the 10.
Yeah.
You'll notice that I did not name Thomas Jefferson. Almost all those polls names Jefferson. Because Jefferson, of course, is the one who gave us the greatest expression of American philosophy, the Declaration of Independence. And he was 2 terms, and he was a very good party leader, and he got half of Louisiana. And he got all of Louisiana purchased without war. But I always felt that he was not a very good and strong president, and he was not a very good governor in Virginia, too. But a lot of people disagree with that. They regard Jefferson as much higher, and they usually put him on their list.
Yeah. I'm curious, since we're probably at the Hall Institute going to do something similar to what we did 4 years ago. If we were having this conversation back in 2007, and if I asked you the questions I asked about Governor Christie, about Barack Obama, how would you have said he was suited to be a president?
Well, I think the difficulty with being a senator, whether you're Kennedy or Obama or Dole or whatever, is you really don't have any experience running organizations, and I think that's the big problem. Governors do. Even governors of fairly small states like Arkansas, they have that experience of dealing with difficulties. And I think that's one of the problems that's one of the things I would have pointed out about Obama. I think he's been able to inspire people. But there are periods in which he, although this was true of Franklin Roosevelt too, just sort of lapses into a kind of lethargy, and you're not quite sure what's going on. Yeah. And he did that, it seems to me, during the time of the debate over medical care, which was going to be his signature. I can't say, though, that at Christie, that he shows any signs of lethargy. He just keeps banging away at one issue after another. But you're right, not all of them. The toolkit, for example, a good portion of his toolkit is still sitting in the legislature.
Right. Okay. Do you think he could win if he were to run?
No. I think he could win the nomination for vice president, and I think he will be vice president on the Republican ticket.
Although he keeps saying who would want me as their number 2 person, but I think if they offer you that...
they offer it to you, can't say no, but I think that I don't... he's right. I mean, he would be ready for it. But if you look at the Republicans that are being mentioned, there's nobody there that you're going to really be excited about, including Republicans. Yeah. I mean, some of the people are just totally out of the pale, like Palin. And it's kind of fun to listen to. My God, you want her sitting with the great nations of the world? Newt Gingrich, oh, just a terrible man who's got more religious conversions than St. Paul. Mitt Romney, whom I've known from Massachusetts, that man has flip-flopped more times than a bowl of potatoes on a table. He was pro-abortion, anti-abortion. He was pro-gay rights, anti-gay rights. He was the father of Obamacare. Now, people are going to say, well, what do you stand for? And of course, the answer is, I don't stand for anything except my own ambition. Whereas we talk about Lincoln, what did Lincoln stand for? People knew what he stood for. He stood for the end of the expansion of slavery into the territories. That was the one thing he wouldn't give on. Now, was he an abolitionist? No. But history made him the emancipator.
Yeah, I think you kind of made a good point about the Republican candidates that are out there. It's one of the reasons why Christie's name keeps, surfacing, and they do polls where he's not even entered. He hasn't. He keeps denying he's interested, and yet he comes out on top or near the top of the poll. So I think, we're going to continue to hear his name mentioned on the short list of candidates as much as he continues to deny it.
He tells us the things that we all know are true in our heart about how profligate we've been. Yeah. We don't really want to hear the solutions. Yeah. We don't want to cut Social Security. We don't want to play around with the age. We don't want to get rid of collective bargaining rights for the public. So I think that we know what he stands for. We know in our heart some of the stuff he's saying is right. Certainly in New Jersey, I mean, there's no better example of an indictment of liberal government than New Jersey. I remember we sat across the street at our Hall Institute offices, and I watched in disbelief as John Corzine got up and said to the workers, we got to fight for a good contract together. I thought, wow, hey, you're management, remember? Weren't you at Goldman Sachs? That, I think, is what pretty much turned the people of New Jersey. Christie would never do that. Christie knows where he's from. And his record, by the way, never talks about it anymore. He was a really good record as attorney for the federal, the federal district, for the federal attorney. Every one of the people he indicted was found guilty. Yeah. Unlike Spitzer, who went after a whole bunch of people, and very few of them ever got banged by the judicial process. He just went after them. Christie ran tight cases. But the problem with district attorneys is, someone once said to me, whether they're Tom Dewey or Giuliani or Christie, after a while they assume that everybody's a crook and you can't deal with anybody because they're all contaminated. So you have to be careful where you come from. Just as I said kiddingly, you can't run the government based on how you run a faculty meeting because it's just, and it never reaches closure. The same thing is true where the experiences that you come from. Eisenhower became, of course, the general of the armies. He ran his administration like he ran the American forces in World War II.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about where you come from. In looking at Christie's administration in the first year, you can see a lot of elements of being a prosecutor, and that's why we see him taking on the NJEA, state employees unions, different things like that, which as you said, has worked well for him. Whether or not they translate onto the big stage remains to be seen, but we'll be keeping an eye on it here at the Hall Institute. So
I think he'll be vice president on the Republican ticket. Okay. We ought to we'll have a poll on our website to see if people agree.
Okay, well, we'll come back. I'm sure we'll be doing a lot of things on the presidential election, but maybe around the time of the presidential convention, we'll see if you were right.
The Jeb Bush, Chris Christie ticket.
Okay.
The president would be in trouble.
Okay, we'll see what happens. So, Mike, thanks for changing seats and being guests. I think it's been a good discussion. Thanks, viewers, for watching. This is the Hall Institute Public Forum. My name is Richard Lee. Our guest has been Michael Riccards, Executive Director of the Hall Institute. Please watch us again soon.